Hello, History 72B, Winter Quarter 2024. I am trying out yet another microphone, so we will see if this works a little bit better. And then someday we'll deal with the glare on the glasses. In the first lecture, I suggested that although it might seem like defining what a woman is would be a straightforward exercise, this is not the case at all. Words attached to power differentials, and both woman and man are such words in American culture. These words are notoriously tricky to pen down exactly. That is one of the important ways in which they actually function. We all think that we are talking about the same thing, and there is enough overlap and blurring to make that seem reasonable. But once we start trying to agree on the definition and meaning, we find that we actually are thinking substantively different things. This can make understanding one another in the present tricky, and it makes understanding historical sources even trickier. In Lecture 3 here, we will examine some of the limitations of communication with an idea that we will want to keep this in mind whenever we look at any historical source. We will look briefly at the history of women's history and then see two words that you are forbidden to use in this class and why I want you to avoid them this quarter in this class. We looked a bit at the ambiguity of communication when I picked apart the designation of this course. Simple, everyday meanings often require considerable cultural knowledge to understand. This cultural knowledge is so naturalized that often people in the same historical context, who all would define most words in predictable and fairly consistent terms, also derive an additional suite of meanings that are specific to each person from all communication, like this lecture. When considering spoken communication, inflection is the modulation of intonation or pitch in the voice, or you could say an inflection in someone's voice is a change in its tone, loudness, or pitch as they are speaking. Sometimes a difference of inflection in a spoken sentence can completely change the meaning for those in the know. This whole thing can work quite differently in a language other than English, and that's part of the point. Sometimes it doesn't matter if people interpret communication in different ways, but sometimes it does. Here's an example. If I try to read the sentence on the slide currently without the tone of my voice changing and without emphasizing some words more than others, it's actually fairly difficult. The only way that I could do it is to leave spaces between the words to disconnect them and to practice a lot. Spouse often wonders who Pat and Kim are. Here goes. Pat likes Kim. It feels a bit like the patched together sentences in train stations and airports. Of course, we don't talk this way. So we indicate meaning by saying exactly the same phrase in different ways. Pat likes Kim. Pat likes Kim? Pat likes Kim. But what if we are reading the sentence, maybe in an email? Let's say that your friend is telling you something they think is important about people you don't really know. Your friend introduced you to these people at one point, but you cannot remember who was who, and you don't want your friend to know that you've forgotten. Is there any way to tell from the three words whether your friend is telling you that Pat likes Kim, or asking you if it really is true that Pat likes Kim, or expressing pleasure that Pat likes Kim? We can indicate the correct interpretation of the sentence by putting marks at the end of the sentence. Problem solved. But that only works if you and your friend have enough cultural knowledge to derive the same meaning from dots and squiggles. Punctuation, like question marks, actually encodes considerable information in one squiggle and dot. We know that the middle sentence should be read as a question. We also know how to make the phrase sound so that it is clearly a question. So we know that our hypothetical friend is asking us something. If we grew up speaking American English, our cultural knowledge lets us derive more meaning from three words. If historians in the future know the punctuation code, they can learn more from our email. More, but still not as much as from a spoken sentence. This on the slide, incidentally, is ancient Latin. All letters were capitals, and there was not anything really in the way of regular punctuation or spaces between words. If you want to read this to understand it, you have to know the forms of the words that indicates things like whether a noun is a subject or object of the sentence, or in the case of verbs, present, future, how many people, and so on. The first line of this actually reads Senatus Populus Quae Romanus, meaning the Senate and the Roman people. Changing the emphasis in the sentence conveys more information. So, for instance, Pat likes Kim, Pat likes Kim, Pat likes Kim, but this time it's not reflected in the written version. There are different ways to indicate emphasis, but in current American English, these are inconsistent and often not entirely clear. So even with the end of sentence punctuation, our future historian cannot be absolutely certain exactly how to interpret the question, Pat likes Kim. The more we know about the context in which this sentence appears, the closer we could come to knowing the meaning that the writer intended. Context can also help us in situations where the meaning of the same set of symbols varies over space. Variation in space is linked to change over time. In other words, historical context. For example, at one point in the mid-19th century, after the process of vulcanization had been worked out, both erasers and condoms were made from rubber. And pants are still articles of clothing with 2 holes for legs and 1 for the trunk of the body. Both sets of meanings on the slide here, so a rubber as an eraser or as a condom, and pants as specifically an undergarment or an outer garment, both of these sets of meanings have a fairly clear connection to one another. Made out of rubber at one time, worn on the lower body. They all make sense. However, our future historians still need some knowledge of historical context, or they are likely to go well astray in their analysis. This is true for both words, clearly, but we are going to focus on pants here. Pants can and do convey meanings beyond a form of clothing worn on the lower body, and those meanings contain more meanings. The reason that the pants confusion here is amusing is that there are very different social reactions to undergarments, which indicate intimacy and should not be worn exposed in public, unless you're a supermodel, and outer garments, which are totally okay to have visible as long as the setting is the correct one. The overlaid meanings require a certain degree of context knowledge, but they still make some sense, at least in terms of clothing the body. But what about when a meaning disconnects from any obvious association with the official meaning of the word? I lived in England for a couple of years. When I first arrived, I knew that pants meant underwear and not trousers, but that did not help me interpret headlines like this one. French dictionary says pants to the past. Pants also meant not good, rubbish. So the article talks about a new French English dictionary that includes more words from English than previous ones because of the long-term official protection of the purity of the French language. So this is saying the French dictionary is making a break from the past and is doing something different. Communication through spoken or written language is not a matter of just substituting words for the same physical object, as in our example, trousers or underwear. Words combine with the sort of unconscious cultural knowledge that I started talking about in the last lecture to adopt new meanings that simultaneously seem obvious to the speaker, but potentially illogical to others. Particular meanings emerge in particular historical contexts, and they perform a certain amount of what I call behind the scenes work. In the example shown here, the use of pants is intended at one level to add humor to a headline on a somewhat dry topic like dictionaries. But there is still so much more here. In the headline, the humor is only fully legible if the reader is familiar with nationalist stereotypes circulating in the given historical context shared by many white British folks. These British images of both themselves and the French have developed over the course of several centuries at least, but our topic is women and gender. I suspect that you already have an idea that an American English meaning of pants is associated with constructions of sex gender. In the US, pants has taken on an entire collection of meanings requiring cultural knowledge. Some of these have dropped out of use and some have stayed. The formation and fate of words and phrases over time is not just a neutral bit of trivia. Communication both reflects and affects cultural ideas and assumptions. So we've got to beat the pants off someone, to bore the pants off someone, keep your pants on, catch someone with their pants down, charm the pants off someone, fly by the seat of one's pants, have ants in one's pants, scare the pants off someone, and smarty pants. But we are going to zoom in on the phrase in blue, to wear the pants in a family or relationship, which carries the meaning of a man taking a dominant position in relation to his partner or family. To warn you before we move on, in the next slide, there is both profanity and problematic content largely aimed at women. We are going to focus a little closer on the expression to wear the pants in a family or relationship. I don't know what size screen you are using, but if you can read these images, the power dynamic represented is an extremely powerful one. So on the left, we have this was a beer ad at one time, and they had this kind of supposed to be sophisticated looking Playboy world traveler guy. And in the meme, they put, "I don't often admit my wife wears the pants," because you already know that. So this is mocking this image of this tough guy by implying that he's not tough because his woman is the one who controls his family life. The next one says, "She wears the pants and you don't think you're whipped?" Now, there's a lot in this one. One is, again, insulting a man because the implication is that he should have control and a woman should not. And then there's also this whipped here. They have left out, obviously, pussy whipped, which is an insult to women on many levels, as I'm sure you're aware, but ask if you're not. The third one says, it shows a man's lower legs with the skirt and high heels. And it says, "If she wears the pants, then you are wearing a skirt. Be a man, not a little bitch." Ooh, there's a lot of gendered things going on there. But we can take just the first part. The idea here is that someone always must be in control, and that control is made visible by articles of clothing that are gendered. So if she wears the pants, you're wearing a skirt, and that's an insult because being like a woman is insulting, which is also where we get to this very last line here. The last one shows a man crying, and it says, "When you realize your wife wears the pants." And yet again, the idea is that a man is somehow worth less if he is not in control of a woman, or if a woman has any say and control in what he does. Dockers, I don't know if you know them, but they make trousers. Dockers created an advertising campaign entirely centered on the expression "wear the pants." You may need to enlarge these to read details on some of them, but these ads all use the association of men and pants stored in the phrase "wear the pants" to link a certain description or image of man with the trousers that they want to sell. The one on the lower left is the most straightforward about the message encoded in the text. I won't read the whole thing, but the first lines say, "Once upon a time, men wore the pants and wore them well. Women rarely had to open doors." And open doors here implies both literal doors and the figurative meaning of open doors as to move ahead and provide opportunity for others. Now, we all know that opening doors is a cultural thing with a very narrow window in time in which it had meaning. The middle image here draws on class and race inequality to give a particular meaning to, quote, "Face it, you're a man," that defines all men as having the similar character of not being women. So you may have other disadvantages, but you're not a woman. So it's good. The one on the right is ostensibly or supposedly about movies, but links to a particular construction of masculinity. It highlights words like hero, associates men with concepts like adventure and risk, for example, symbolized by sports cars. And I will leave it to you to decide whether placing the word action sliding into the center of the waistband toward the crotch was deliberate on the part of the advertisers or not. By using this phrase, "wear the pants," and elaborating on it in this way, the advertising does not just count on cultural knowledge, it helps to create and reinforce that knowledge. The power of the expression "wear the pants" in the images I showed relies on associations that are part of our cultural knowledge, whether we want them or not. These words are culturally linked: pants, male, power, better, which means that these words are also linked: skirt, female, vulnerability, less good. In order to get the memes and the advertisements, the viewer needs to know multiple layers of meaning folded into the expression "wear the pants." This is what I mean when I say that a word or expression does behind the scenes work. Getting the memes or the ads I showed relies on the viewer having the associations above form pretty much automatically in their minds, even if they are not aware of it, even if they would not be able to explain it, even if they can explain it, are aware of it, but disagree completely. They still know it's there. This reality of constantly adapting meanings linked to structures of power creates a challenge for historians who need to balance reading the past with not allowing their own historical context and assumptions to affect how they understand what they see. Historians build on the work of historians before them. We don't rewrite history every time we think about something. So we need to evaluate that work by considering three contexts: our own historical context, the historical context of our subjects, the people we're studying in the past, and the historical context of our secondary sources. This means that historians also look at the history of history, what is known as historiography. You do not need to remember the word historiography, but I do want you to keep in mind that history as a discipline is subject to historical context. I'm going to break the history of women's history into three parts. It is, of course, more complicated, as everything is, but this will help us see some patterns. Although these parts have developed sequentially, this is a process of developing and adding on, not completely replacing. There are now what I am calling standard historians, as well as social and cultural historians. The more historians approach a topic from different perspectives, the more likely we are to get closer to answers to historical questions. I am using standard history to designate branches of history that center on different areas, like political history, economic history, military history, that have been the focus of Western historians for a long time. If I were in one of those fields, I would not lump them all together. But Western women's history initially branched off at a time when these all shared a particular style or approach. I generally characterize that approach as the great men and battles history because the focus tended to be on men in positions of power and events that were associated with major political or national changes. Historians, many of the women, started to ask more and more insistently, where are the women? They must have existed. This painting may be familiar to you. It is a picture of the founding fathers signing or reviewing an important document. We'll come back to that later. The approach taken by these early women historians saying, where are the women, largely followed the great men and battles model. Women's historians looked at women in the past who appeared most closely associated with changes to things like politics, national boundaries, war, and so on. Basically, it was to find and study great women. You see this approach still reflected in celebrations of things like Women's History Month, the first woman pilot, the first woman to swim the Atlantic Ocean. No, I don't think anyone's actually done that, but there are articles on the specific women who reputedly broke boundaries or were first. Now, I'm not dissing these women. I'm saying that there are more ways to look at things, as historians discovered. The woman on the slide is Abigail Adams, and you have in your readings for a later module a set of letters between Abigail Adams and her husband discussing the political rights of women, possibilities there. So just doing great women history alone tends to give the impression that women are continually entering a world that they only affect through what have been considered men's roles. It's a bit like having a picture and putting women into it without changing anything else. The social history approach started with questions like, we know about wealthy and powerful people, but what about everyone else? This is sometimes called a bottom-up approach. It focuses on the lives and experiences of people whose stories have not been told and retold or even told at all. Social history is an approach that is used in many branches of history. Women's and gender history is just one of those. As social historians did more work, as they accumulated more data and information, the big question shifted from what was everyone else doing to how did these groups of people shape history? Because they did. So for women's history, it wouldn't just be adding women to the picture, but noticing how focusing on women changed the picture. Before I move on, I am going to point out the screamingly obvious because it reflects the reality of how different people who did the work of early women's history gained places in the university academic system overall. Everyone in the pictures that I have been showing you here, we would classify as white. In reality, only some of the everyone else women were white. Interests have broadened from the end of the 20th century, but better is not enough, if for no other reason than that it produces flawed or incomplete historical analysis. Moving on. Cultural history started to ask questions like, why is there a category of woman at all? How does sorting people into men and women function in the power structures of society? Have people always been sorted the same way, or do the categories adjust over time in ways that continue to support a particular way of distributing power? Why two categories, women and men? The range of variation in humans does not really sort neatly into two categories. So this approach was a bit like asking why an artist created a painting at all and why they used the medium that they did. Again, this is an oversimplification, but it will help you get oriented as we go on in this class. You have a short piece by Nancy Cott in your readings, and she is one of the major figures in the early development of women in gender history. In this paper, she's discussing that development up to the time of publication. And that was 1992, meaning that this piece is itself a type of primary source. Women's history, gender history, methodology, and theory have moved on since 1992. That's part of the point. The Carol Vance article that I've given you was written even earlier, in 1989, as social construction theory opened up new ways of looking at society and a whole new set of questions. The drawback of the Vance article is that social construction theory was in such early stages that she describes some parts in ways that are not accurate anymore. The positive to the Vance article, though, and the reason that I'm giving it to you, is the insight it gives into the sorts of arguments and reflexive pushback that early scholars who used social construction theory had to deal with. We will be taking a closer look at social construction theory in the next lecture. So if you're panicking and thinking, I don't know what that is, cease panicking, you will be okay. In the meantime, I want to place one thought in your head so it can percolate. Social construction is not about the way that society constructs individuals. That's nurture. Social construction is about the way that an overarching society is built or constructed. In other words, the social in social construction is what is being constructed, not what is doing the construction. And that brings us to part 3, problems with tradition and progress. These words do a lot of invisible behind the scenes work. They tend to obscure the very questions that we want to look at in this class. Tradition and its forms, traditional, traditionally, are often used to mean that's the way it was before a particular change that I'm interested in or that I'm annoyed by happened. But traditional for whom and for how long? The form of family that we often hear referred to as the traditional American family is also called the nuclear family, as opposed to, say, an extended family. The man, father, woman, mother, plus their children, neatly divided into sons and daughters, idea of family is a tradition that dates all the way back to, drumroll, the beginning of the Cold War after World War II. In other words, the 1950s. Traditional makes this family structure sound as if it has a long, deep, universal history, when in fact it does not. This works in part because the word family and some idea of what family is has older roots. People assume that family has always meant the same thing with the same exact specifics, like rubbers and pens. Progress has similar issues. What counts as progress and for whom and why? Progress also gives the idea of an inexorable current towards better, whatever better may be. But that's not actually the way things work. In a large, comprehensive picture of human history, if only because what counts as better or progress is not the same for every person in every time and place, and in regard to every possible aspect of life. When you are out in the larger world, you can use these terms, of course, but I would like you to avoid both of these words in your writing for this particular course. It will help you to be more historically clear and specific, and it will help you question things that might not have appeared questionable before. Key points for lecture 2. Words, spoken or written, contain layers of meaning. Words and expressions also change meaning in all of those layers over time and space. The more historical context an historian knows, the more likely they are to interpret historical documents or sources successfully. Historians must keep track of three historical contexts that can influence their interpretation of the past: the context of the time they are studying, their own historical context, the historical context in which the secondary source or sources that they use was or were written. The history of women's history reflects increasing awareness of the influence of the historian's own context. A simplified series of types of history may be described as standard history, social history, cultural history. The words tradition and progress and their variants tap into our cultural knowledge to do behind the scenes work that interferes with good historical practice, especially for our topic. Do not use those words: no tradition, no traditional, no traditionally, no progress in your writing for this course. I will leave you to ponder this image with respect to our pants discussion. This poster tries to counter the pants power man associations that we have explored briefly in this lecture. So it shows both a woman and a man in skirts, and it says, stop focusing on who wears the pants in a relationship. Relationships work best when no one is wearing pants. And obviously, that's somewhat suggested. So, this poster is using the method of flipping the script. Flipping here means reversing assumed gender roles, like the princess rescuing the dude in distress. You might use this poster as a jumping off point to consider: does the messaging rely on the same assumptions that it challenges? Is it effective at making change? What other embedded cultural meanings appear in this poster, both in the text and in the imagery? There is no single correct answer here to any of that, which makes it far more interesting to consider.